Afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our normal editing session, as we normally have every week. Last week, obviously, we did our live stuff with Chris Burkhardt. So this week, we're back to editing in that thing, Capture One. So Capture One being the piece of software which is a raw editor made by the guys out in Denmark. So for today, just as a bit of a warning, we have a challenge with connections and stuff like that. So even though I'm in my normal place, as you can see, unfortunately, BT have decided to be completely useless for many, many days and weeks. So we're on 4G. So if something goes wrong, apologies in advance. Hopefully it all the bonded stuff we've done holds out. But it's also why there may be a little lag today compared to normal. When you put your comments in, we're probably around 10 to 12 seconds behind. So it's not quite as instant as it normally would be, but please, throughout the next hour, do comment, question, challenge, ask away as we're editing stuff, because I want it to be as interactive as we can. So today we're using version 22. Now, actually, there is an update to version 22. There's actually 15.1.2 out there now, which added in OM1 support from Olympus. But for the purposes of today, I'm sticking with 15.1 for no reason. There's no bad reason. It's just without normal internet, I haven't upgraded or I haven't updated it. So that's the version we're going to be working on today. If you're on version or Capture One 21, which was last year's version, or 20, strangely the year before's, you're probably able to follow along with most things that we're going to cover. If you're on something like version 12, which was the one prior to version 20, there's a bit of a jump, then you're going to find quite a few things are missing. So if you're not a Capture One user, you can download a free trial. That trial is available on capture1.com. Just go to it. It's 30 days for free. Off you go. If you are a Capture One user and you're not up to date, go into your account. You can see the options. If you subscribe, you've always got access to the latest version. If you're a person who prefers to buy their license, or a perpetual license user as they're known, then just bear in mind that you've got some upgrade costs if and when you choose to want to keep it up to date. So that said, version 22 brought in HDR and Panos stitching, which were the two big features with it, along with some wireless tethering for Canon. And we're going to start actually today's session with some challenges, let's call them. So some Pano stitching issues and some HDR issues. Let's go into here. So this is a shot from Mark. He submitted it into, actually it was part of, I think, the Facebook group. Yeah, it was. So we were talking about the Facebook group before. Mark was having some problems with this shot, having stitched it, and it was around vignetting, or the fact that certain areas wouldn't allow a filter or an adjustment to be done to it. So if we have a look at this, and I'm just going to give you the extreme example of why that's gone the way it has. Unfortunately, it's not actually an issue with Panos stitching as such. What Mark was seeing was an issue with the way that clarity works, for example. So if we push clarity a little bit, in fact, let's zoom into there. Okay. So we're in looking at a nice detailed shot. It's a very, very big stitch, really nicely done. And let's up our clarity. So we're going to move our clarity up a little bit. Okay. Let's move it up a lot. Now, this is overdoing it. You wouldn't normally do it this much. Please don't. But while it looks fine here, when I zoom out, we see this going on the outside. And this here was seen to be an issue with Panos stitching. So the issue with the sort of bumpiness of the shot, so when you get dark areas and light areas, that issue is actually caused by not having the light fall off ticked in the lens profile. So if we go to our lens tab over here in Capture One, this one had a generic, because it's a panoramic DNG that's been sent through, but you would normally choose your lens and you would slide this light fall off up to probably 100. You can see, don't do it in the actual pano because it's not going to have the same effect. But in the individual shots, slide it up to 100, and it's going to mean that you don't get that vignetting every time there's a new piece of the stitched panel. But that's not the issue here. The issue here is that we're getting this weird lightening all the way along here on the outside, and it's caused by over clarity or too much clarity. So let's have a look over here and let's think about what this is actually doing. Now, for a start, this is too much clarity. 88 on that line, the thing only goes up to 100. So just be careful that you don't push it too far. But beyond that, there is an issue here, which is the way that clarity works between dark areas up here and light areas down there. So the dark areas at the top work perfectly fine for clarity because it looks at it and it says, okay, what do I do on this side of the border? Well, I'm going to just lighten it up some more. That makes sense when we're trying to get some mid-tone stuff going on. So when we're trying to increase the contrast within tiny little deviations, going from the border and saying, right, if you're a lighter area, make you lighter, and a darker area, make you darker, then that's what adds our contrast in. That's what's doing all that stuff. But if you do that on an area up here, like this great big dark area on the corner and this border here and then this light area down here, all that's going to happen is clarity is just going to push stuff way, way, way too bright. So with that push too bright, we end up with this almost halo around here, because what happens is it's got to get back to normal by the time it gets to this area here. So you've effectively got this sort of, I guess, seesaw effect with clarity, which is it's got to make things darker or lighter based on where that border is, but then it's got to get back to normal once it comes away from such a strong contrast change. And as it moves away from that border, it slowly gets back to normal. And you can see it. So it's made this border really bright and then slowly, slowly, slowly back to normal down here. It's fine in a textured area. That's exactly what it's doing around here. If I turn off clarity quickly and add it back on again, you can see it's got lighter, darker, and that's what's added in contrast. But when there's such a big area up here of massive contrast, and it's caused by the fact that we've got this panoramic stitch which is coming in from the sides, it's not filling the whole frame, you're going to end up with these, what we would normally refer to as halos around that border. So unfortunately, this is almost a byproduct of the panoramic stitching, that whenever you're going to use clarity or push it to really high amounts, you're going to risk introducing these things at the very edges. Now, you could argue, well, what happens if I crop? Oops, let's go unconstrained. So let's crop in away from those black margins, all the way in there. So that helps us a little bit, but you're going to start to lose some of your image. That's the problem. So we've got this real, I guess, struggle here between getting the most out of our image and not ending up with these great big halos, because the nearer I come in away from those edges, the less of that halo you're going to see. But the halo around the edges, it's not a case that clarity is not applying. It's the case that clarity is applying. But the way that it's applying, unfortunately, is literally overdoing things. It's going to this dark corner here and saying, right, well, you're lighter than me, so I'm going to really brighten you up, and going to this corner here and saying, well, you're darker than me, so I need to be brighter as well. And you end up with this effect. So it's not, I think, Mark, originally you were sort of in the mindset that this is the brush not applying, or it was the deep sky brush I think you were using, not applying in every place around the image. I don't think it's that. I think it's actually the brush is applying, because if I turn my mask on, sorry, I'm not mask, I'm on the background, of course it's applying everywhere. But even if it was on a layer, a filled layer is filling everywhere in that image. It is applying everywhere across that entire image. It's just where those dark borders are, it's going to have that effect. And if we look at this shot, so exactly the same is going to happen. It's just you're not going to notice it as much because it's so dark. But if I push the clarity up, we can see it's more of an effect here next to that black area than it is here in the main image. So you're always going to have this whenever you've got these dark areas around the edges. And unfortunately, and I mean this in the literal sense, it is unfortunate, the Pano tool at the moment doesn't allow us to crop in. So as in, it doesn't exclude any external areas. It doesn't do content aware fill. It doesn't give you the I guess the freedom, as it were, to exclude bits that are removed. So we have some problems basically, and we have to work within those limitations. So good question, Jeff. So should I or should have cropped before adjustments? Not necessarily, because you're still going to have these areas outside that are affecting what's going on within the whole image. But is it better to do a larger pano? As it is right now, yes. If you are planning on using the very edges, regardless of Capture One, I'd always say this anyway. If you are planning on using the very edges of this this frame, I absolutely would shoot wider and higher if you need to. I wouldn't entirely avoid stopping where you want to where you want the frame to end, because the second you do that, you're gonna run into issues like this. And actually, even forgetting the halos, if you think about this angle here, because it's had to stretch some of that in the pano stitch, well, that angle means that we're going to lose some of this up here anyway. So if I put something really important up on this top right hand side, well, that's not going to help me either, unfortunately, because all of a sudden that stretching in the projection is going to lose things at the edges. So my gut feel is this is something that should and will be improved over time, but right now just plan for this stuff. Plan on shooting wider, stitching wider, planning on having almost a margin or a border that allows you to do this stuff without worrying about these margins. Beyond that, there's a wider thing in my head, which is don't push clarity too much. If you are pushing clarity up to sort of 70, 80, 90, we're probably overdoing it a bit. It kind of works on this shot. Also be careful with clarity that if you had some dust spots, you're going to see a lot more dust spots with clarity that you wouldn't necessarily see without it as easily. So lots of reasons to not overdo clarity, full stop. But in the case of a panoramic stitch, unfortunately right now, with the way that the panoramic stuff is working, you've got to plan in for this. So you're going to have to think about, I've got throwaway zones on the edges, and those throwaway zones are not just about the projection. It's not just about the black borders here. It's also about the effect that it has on the inside of the image. Tobias, can you apply clarity on an adjustment layer that excludes the black area? We can. Let's show you. So if I were to create a new filled adjustment layer, let's just for ease, I could do it as a rectangle, but let's just increase that size and get rid of anything that's the black margin. So I'm actually making a point of going in further than we need to, just so that we're definitely not touching any of the black margin. There we go, and there, good. Hopefully, everyone, that stuttering that some of you were talking about is gone now. I'm not sure why that was happening, but let's hope it stays the same. So, new adjustment layer. This, as Tobias has said, we've removed any of the margin from this area. So now let's push our clarity up and look what happens. It's the same issue. It's less pronounced, let's put it that way, but it's still the same thing, because at the edge here on clarity, and this would apply to any picture, it's not just about Panos here. At this edge here, what are you asking clarity to do? Well, you're telling clarity to look at its neighbor and get lighter or darker depending on what the neighbor is. Well, here, maybe it thinks that this bit is slightly darker, so it's going to lighten as it goes out to the edge, and then our mask stops. So as the mask stops, we've got a light area, and then all of a sudden, back to the normal photograph. So it doesn't really help us to exclude it from the shot, because we actually lose some of the natural fall-off that would come on here. And as I say, this isn't just about pano stitching. This isn't just a phenomenon with these black margins. The black margins really don't help, because it really pushes that bit to the inside of it to be lighter. But even in a normal scenario, the second we start putting in edges into a clarity adjustment, you're gonna notice this stuff. And it's the reason why we try and almost soften down those edges. We try not to use hard masks. So there is an argument that says on this layer, if let's just turn on the mask. If, for instance, I put a very, very soft, really low opacity brush on the edge, of course it would help if I could brush outside, but we can't do that. So let's just go here, and I'm just basically going to feather in that mask. So what happens long term, let's just get this done a bit quicker. So what happens over the mask itself as it starts to gradiate away is you don't notice it. It's still going on, but you don't notice it as much at those edges. So the softer I make those edges, the better it is for that fall off of clarity. And this is why if you're using clarity, we always tend to use a soft brush, because at some point you've got to hit, you're going to come up against that wall, which is clarity is applied here and it's not applied there, or there was a big contrast difference here and there isn't there. And that brick wall, which is pretty much isn't exactly something that we can fix in any software. You know, this is going to apply to any software that applies the effect of clarity. At some point, that effect is going to stop. And when it does, it's obvious. So we, I guess for one of the better phrase, we cheat. We soften the edges so you don't notice it. But the flip side to that, and the risk of that, is that unfortunately you then don't apply it all the way out to the edge of the image, which I think was where Mark's initial challenge was. So yes, there are some Pano challenges specifically around clarity because of these black borders, and it means that you're seeing some of these halos come in a little bit more extreme than you might be used to. I would argue if you're using more than 30, 40, 45-ish on clarity, it's probably overdoing it, unless it's a very specific case. So think about not using it so much, but if you do have to use it that much, plan your shoot. So plan on shooting wider. And Paul's just said, is there a guide on how much extra width there is to shoot on Panos? And I would add, in terms of the actual image, an extra 10% plus all the way around. So, you know, I would start, in fact, let's be honest, I would be on 20% of the overall image size I'm planning. So if you look at a view and you plan on taking that view as your print, I'm going to add 20% on left and right and up and down so that I can avoid all of this stuff. And that applies to regardless of anything. It also helps us not risk losing objects as they're pulled at the edges of any projection. Morton, what if the background was grey? It won't, well, it'll still have an effect. It won't be quite as strong in terms of contrast if we had going from grey to blue, but you're still going to see at some point it's got to get back to normal as it comes in off of the corners of the shot. So it's just about staying away from those corners, and we'll go on to it in a second, but we'll load up another image. And in fact, let's go on to, I'm gonna cheat a little bit and go to Barry's image quickly. So I'm gonna ruin the surprise of what's coming with Barry. So it's not happening here as much on this shot, and you're not getting any of that obvious haloing, but in part because you're not getting those margins for it to bounce off of and have issues with. So we're not used, this is why I'm saying we're not used to seeing this as much. We are used to seeing it. We talked about it in the last session a couple of weeks ago about halos around high contrast points and stuff like that. But what we're seeing in these shots here is it extreme out of the edges. And if you think about it, it's almost like the clarity tool is bouncing off of the edges, because the other tools, if I go to exposure, you know, it's pretty uniform. Yes, it's not affecting up here so much because it's brighter. But if I pull exposure down, you know, we're not getting this halo stuff going on because that's a uniform adjustment. Same with brightness. You know, we're not getting that effect going on because it's a uniform adjustment. Saturation, you're not getting more saturation at the edges and less in the middle because it's applied uniformly across things. If we start to play with HDR and we start to play with clarity, that's where you're starting to see all of this stuff come very obvious. And they're the same tools that we talk about quite often that cause the risk of halos. And that's just one thing on a pano, especially with these cropped areas. Just be really careful. Right, Tim says the stuttering is gone for now. Cool, that's good news. So hopefully, touch wood, we're okay for a while. Right, on to Mark's second image. So again, Panorama, as we just discussed, less of an issue on clarity, even at 100%. But you can see there's sort of this, if you really think about it with your eye, there's a lighter strip there, darker strip on the inside. There's a lighter strip along here, and then it gets darker on the inside. And you can actually see this boundary sort of thing here, lighter here, darker here. If I undo clarity, we see it's not actually that different between these two areas. But with clarity enabled, it's lightened this edge next to the dark area or the black margin, and then it has to get back to normal on the inside. So shoot your panos wider until such time as something like this can be helped in software. But even if it were helped, I'd still be shooting your panos wider than you need. It's just going to be better for you. Right, so this shot, slightly different challenge. So let's just put our clarity back to where we were. And I'm in a very simple place with this one, Mark. You asked what we'd do. Well, I can't really push our exposure too much because we've got some bright areas down here. If I were to push exposure, yes, I'm going to bring up all of the detail in here in the foreground, but we're also going to overblow or blow out the bright parts in the horizon. So instead of that, we can use brightness. So we can pull up brightness, which will have an effect of squashing that histogram rather than moving it. So yes, it's going to brighten up the darker areas, but it's not going to push the lighter areas off the edge, as it were. So it's not going to overdo them and cause them to blow out. But it sort of flattens stuff as well, and that's a bit of a shame. So there's a couple of other tricks that we can play with here. The first is, I was going to go on to the other one, but let's go into this one first. Where do these mountains sit in our histogram? Well, I'm looking at the orange bar on the histogram on the left that's sort of moving around as I move my mouse. That's telling me where everything that's under my mouse is sat on our histogram. And strangely, these mountains are very much in the black area of the high dynamic range tool. So anything in the bottom sort of 5-ish% blacks, anything in the bottom 20-25% shadows. The middle stuff you've got no real control over in HDR. The top 25% is highlights, and then the very, very top sort of 5-ish% is whites. So if I bring up shadows, well, that's going to move everything. So even some of the sky look. So this, where are we? Here, I think. Yeah, some of this sky is probably down there towards the shadow area. Certainly down here is all shadow. So if I lift up shadow, I'm going to get this weird thing where I'm affecting this, but not the mountains. So instead, we're going to use black specifically. And we're going to pull that up so I can start to see detail in these mountains on their own. There's a little bit of a sun beam sort of cresting over the top of that, which is quite cool. So if I pull it up too much, overdone for sure. But what we're actually seeing here is all the detail in the mountains that the camera did see. So we've got a load of information here in this shot, and we are not leaving this shot like this, don't worry. But we've got a load of information in this shot that does actually work. It does give us a load of detail with a bit of noise. Okay, so I'm not going to push it this far, but we are going to pull it up quite a way so I can see some detail in these mountains, certainly the snow out here. That's kind of nice. But what's also happened, and you can see it, is the mountains have gone very, very blue, very purple, very, it's the wrong color really, if I compare it to the rest of this shot. And it's bouncing back, darkness, it's in silhouette, and that's what the camera saw. And it's effectively because the camera shifted its white balance for the sunset or sunrise. That's what it had to do to the mountains or the dark shadows in order to do that adjustment in the sky. Well, we've got a tool in Capture One that changes colors and tones based on where they sit in the histogram. So shadows, midtones, and highlights. And it's here under the color balance tool. So I've lifted up the black, and then in our color balance tool, I can say, right, my shadows, I'm not going to shift the white balance. I could do that, and I'll show you how to in a minute. But my shadows, I can now warm up. I can make them more blue. But more importantly, I can probably neutralize them by going to the opposite side of the color that they've become. So if I show you before, like that, and after, it's now a lot more neutral, a lot more convincing, probably a lot more real than that really blue mountain that we had before. So that's using the black slider and then countering any color cast that's happened as a result of lifting up those shadows with the color balance tool. Instead of that, let's just clone that. I'm going to reset my color balance tool, reset our high dynamic range tool. And on this shot, we're going to use a luma range. So I'm going to create a filled adjustment layer. So that's a mask across everything in this shot. And we're going to get a luma range up here. And I'm going to click on display mask so I can see what's going on. And you can see the default luma range doesn't include everything. It's got this tail off. Now I want to include all of the darkest parts. So no fall off in the shadows. And I'm going to shift where it's including all the way down again to those darkest parts. So we want to include the mountains for sure. Let's go all the way down to there. And we're going to have a nice soft fall off. So we are going to include some stuff outside of the mountains, but not all. And go to apply. So with just the shadows, a bit like lifting up black, but with just the shadows selected, I can now lift exposure. Lift it too much, it's going to look wrong, you can see. So that's just not going to work for us. It's gone flat. But I can lift it quite a way. And more importantly, just like before, where these are starting to go blue as I lift them, well, I don't need to use the color balance tool now. I can actually use white balance to shift that back. So we go from blue mountains up to, let's say, warmer mountains in the sunset. Now, the problem with using a luma range is you can get, and we have in this case, this weird scenario here. So I'm going to load up both images. This one at the top was just using the HDR tool. This one is using the luma range. So what's all this about? Why has it changed this stuff here to be this sort of mush here? Well, let's just zoom out a second. Let's look at what our luma range actually does. So let's go to our luma range and go to display mask. You can see it hasn't actually selected everything, because in here you can see there are shadows, but there are also midtones and there are also highlights. So the luma range has selected the shadows, and remember we have this fall off, so it's avoided the midtones and the highlights. Same down here. So the shadows are selected very strongly, and this fall off has meant that the bits that weren't quite so dark has slowly started to be included and then eventually fall off. So then we take the darkest parts of the image and slowly, not quite so darkest parts of the image. Let's just go on to our grayscale mask so you can see it like this. And it's going to brighten the bits that are masked, so the whitest parts. It's going to brighten the greyest parts a bit less, brighten the dark grey parts even less, and the black parts not at all. So what we end up with is certain parts of the image being lifted and certain parts being left alone. Well, if I lift all the shadows and leave the midtones and highlights where they are, in an area that's got shadows and highlights, what happens? It flattens. So you end up with those shadows matching the highlights, and you've lost all the texture because the texture comes from contrast. So you've got to bear in mind that the luma range is great for isolating certain parts, but where you've got an area like this with a mix of shadows and highlights and midtones, that luma range is going to be so specific that you're going to be lifting shadows or even reducing highlights. It works the same way the other way around. Either way, you're flattening the content. So if ever you use a luma range and you see this, it's because the luma range wasn't the right tool to use. The better tool was the high dynamic range tool and lift either the blacks or reduce the white, whichever way you've got to go. So that's option 2 to be careful with. Option 3, let's create another clone of that one. I'm going to reset, and we're going to change our base characteristics, so our curve, from auto to linear response. Now, linear response has the effect of effectively flattening some of the contrast. It reduces some of the impact of that S-curve that the auto curve puts in. Just a bit of a reminder for those of you that remember this, but for everyone else, auto is film standard. So auto is film standard in general terms. The film standard curve has got a built-in S-curve. And that means that the highlights are pushed a bit more, the shadows are pulled a bit more, so you end up with a greater contrast. Now, if I switch that to linear response and watch the sunset area up here, that's with that curve in, that's without. That's enhanced, auto as it were. That's more like out of the camera. So in a scenario like this, doing that actually softens down some of our highlights. Then I can do the same stuff. So I can still pull up black. We're still getting that weird color shift. I can't make the change through the white balance because I've got to select the area that I need to make that change. And we've seen that's going to cause a little bit of a nightmare. So we're going to go back to our color balance tool, and in our shadows, go to the opposite direction of those blues. In fact, we can make it more gray, more green, more yellow, whatever we want. Probably out there, just to neutralize the effect of that color shift from lifting the shadows. Then, we're all on the background layer here. We haven't even added any layers. But if I look at our sunset here, we've lost some vibrance, and that comes from the fact that that linear response curve is very flat. We just said that. So if I want to start adding in vibrance, but without affecting this huge contrast difference here, well, let's just add a mask in the top. So let's go to a gradient layer. And in fact, we can do the opposite with the luma range of what we were doing just now. So if I turn my mask on, go to our luma range, and with my luma range this time, I'm going to include everything that's bright and exclude things that are dark. And it should take out the mountain. There we go. So we want to make sure we've got enough of the sky in. Everything's on go slow today. A bit annoying. So all of the sky in, not so much of the mountain, and gradually fade out to nothing. In fact, we can probably go to about there. So if I apply that, it's going to apply that luma mask on top of our sky. So I've done a gradient and then said, even though there's a gradient, the bottom bits, which are shadows or the very darkest parts of the image, I don't want you to touch. Let's turn our mask off. So you press M on the keyboard. And with this, we can push up a bit of saturation. We can shift our white balance a little bit. So we can go a bit more pink if we want to. We can push some of the warmth up a little bit if we wanted to. So remember, this one has got that curve built into it. So we could pick on individual colors. So we can go to our color editor and say, do you know what, those reds, let's lighten them up a little bit, but also punch them a touch. Be really careful with saturation in your color editor. You can do some really horrible things, but try and keep things in single digits as a general rule. More than that, ask yourself why. With this layer, of course, we could go into our clarity tool and push a little bit. Again, not too much. And you see those margins appear, just like we talked about at the beginning. So don't push it too much. Mark, you really need to clean your lens. Or the sensor. I think it's actually on the sensor. But give it a clean. Because every time we bring up clarity, we're also going to see things like dust spots as well. But then with all that done, we can then go into our crop. And because we've shot wider than we needed, hint, we can afford to throw away some of these edges, which is the whole point of some of this Panos stitching stuff, and produce that, which kind of works. And if we go to our new variant, so the original, there's our original. There's our edit, but the difference is you can play with this to your heart's content. You can control each element of this through either the high dynamic range, a luma range or luma mask on the top, or the color balance tool, and choose the shadows, the midtones, the highlights, and play with them individually. So, couple questions. So Mark's online, cool. So yeah, explains the problem. Yeah, so annoyingly, and it is annoying, because I would argue it shouldn't be an issue. It should be clever enough to be able to do something with it. But what you were seeing, Mark, wasn't a Panos stitch issue. It's a clarity issue, and it always happens when you've got a strong edge or a strong border, and Clarity's got to work out how to get back to normal, and it does it by adding in halos. So where are we? Ted, what happens if you adjust each individual photo and sync the settings before you combine the images for the panel? You can. Be careful with Clarity specifically, because remember, Clarity is reacting to its neighboring areas. Now, between two different pictures, the impact of a neighboring area may be different, if you see what I mean. So while on this picture you may have a really bright bit on the corner that's having a big impact on the left, on the next panel along, that bright bit was actually only maybe a street lamp. So it gets ignored a bit more in the next one. So you're going to have differing amounts of clarity and stuff. And this would apply if you were going out to an external panoramic stitch as well. It can work. Yes, you can do it that way, but just be careful. Just check things if you've done that to make sure there aren't any weird things coming along the line. Where are we? Joe, magic brush up the mountains. We can. The problem with it, let's just do a quick go at that. Remember that magic brush is looking for similar, let's go with that, pixels. So as I draw my magic brush, remember this is a big pano. It's out of what, 450 meg images, I think, something like that. So yeah, it's gonna do things like this. It's gonna pick up the mountains, but it's also gonna pick up some bits we don't want and some bits we do, and it's not gonna quite get into the depths of it. So let's just try and add a bit more there. You know, it's gonna be painful, and what will happen is at some point you're gonna hit a limit, because again, magic brush is trying to be subtle with that boundary. So when I hit that limit, unfortunately, if I then made some changes, for instance, exposure, well, we're going to see, what are we not seeing? There we are. You're going to see the edges where Magic Brush didn't include it. So my gut feel, those the mountains sit well within the black classification within the histogram. So use it. Use that high dynamic range tool to pull up the black. Use the color balance tool to then fix that that color shift, and you'll end up in a decent place. And you've got a lot more control over each of those elements then. Okay, let's we sort of spoiled this one a little bit because we went to Barry's picture just now to show you the edges, but Barry has been playing with HDR and having a bit of a problem. And one of the problems was that in the blend, so this is the blend from Barry's image, he's seeing halos around here. But I'm seeing something else, which is actually more concerning. And if I'm honest, I'm seeing this a lot with the HDR function, with people putting examples up on it. And I think it's something that really does need to be fixed. And it's around the blending of clouds. So the advice from Capture One is to use 2 or 3 images. That's fine. And then the advice is always, you know, to sort of experiment, I guess. Now, this is a blend, and unfortunately that blend is lending itself to creating these sort of neighboring hard lines. And this was having used 3 images. So when we pull 3 images together, this is what's coming out, and it's made worse if I pull down highlights and whites. Look at these clouds here. It's just wrong. So let's have a look at what happens then if I don't use all 3 images. What happens if I just use 2? And I'm looking at these images. What you haven't actually got, Barry, in here is an image that's exposed for the highlights. If it were exposed for the highlights, I'd be able to see all this detail in here in this cloud formation where the sun is. So you don't have enough of a highlight exposure in here. You have a mid-tone exposure. This one actually isn't giving you much more over the shadows in this one. So I'm going to blend just this and this. Go to merge to HDR. And let's just see what happens when we only use 2 rather than the 3. I'm happy to discard the brightest image that you've got because it's not adding anything to that middle image. So here's my new blend here, and look at those clouds. So there's your blend with 3. In fact, let's just do that same, pull these all the way down. So I allowed Capture One to adjust it automatically as well. But there's your blend of 3. There's my blend of 2. Now, some of it is coming from the fact that the clouds have moved. So if I pull this down as well, so highlights and whites, highlights and whites, and highlights and whites. So there's our shadow, or our highlight exposure, as it were. There's our mid-tone. Clouds have moved quite a lot. And there's our brightest version. And what's happening is the brightest and the mid-tone, the clouds, for some reason, haven't moved too much. It's probably because of the speed of those shots. They were very, very quick between each other. But I've got 2 strong images with the clouds in one place. And then I've got the image for my highlights with the clouds in another place. So it was taking some time afterwards. That's always going to happen with a sequence, of course. But in that case, we're confusing Capture One to a certain extent. Capture One gets a little bit thrown off because it's like, well, I've got these 2 images here which show a cloud in this position and 1 image here with a cloud in that position. So what do? And it seems to have a bit of a, we used to call these brain farts, but it sort of has that, where it doesn't know how to fix this or how to blend it because it's not designed to create content. It's not designed to do content-aware fill or to blend clouds or anything like that. It's designed to blend areas which have got highlight detail, shadow detail, and get the best exposed pixels. As things move in the sky, it struggles sometimes. And I'm seeing this, as I say, with a couple of examples that I've seen around and about. So if you do have this problem, try using less frames. So in other words, the period of time from the beginning of your exposures through to the end of your exposures is shortened. That means that the things haven't moved so much, but it also means that Capture One's got less of a blending challenge. And you see the difference between that one and that one. Now, I've got the same amount of detail in here. In fact, let's just, because this one's been auto-adjusted, so let's just copy these settings and paste them to there so they look the equivalent. I'd say the one with only 2 images is a bit cooler, so we probably need to warm that back up a little bit, maybe to there. Okay. But you can see that difference in the clouds. Let's just pull these 2 up together. Where are we there? So I'm seeing the complaints here and there about these sort of weird jaggedy artifacts and stuff like that. Those complaints are completely valid. I get it. This should not happen in an HDR blend, but some of it we can fix ourselves by being a bit careful in terms of choosing which frames we use to blend. So this shot itself, you can, Barry, get away with just 2 frames. You don't need that 3rd one. And actually, as a wider point, like I was saying earlier, think about what each frame delivers. This frame here, let me just reset the adjustments. This is not a frame that's exposed for the highlights. This is a frame that's slightly underexposed. You needed one that was actually detailed in that highlight out here, out of the camera. So throw away the shadows, ignore them, they can underexpose. But I want to see detail out here, not this blowout. That is not an exposed for highlights frame. This here is probably almost an exposed for shadows frame. This one is definitely an exposed for shadows frame. So you kind of needed bigger steps. If I look at this, you've got a 30th of a second, a 60th of a second, and a 160th of a second. So this one is pretty much almost 1 stop away from this one. It's actually, where are we at? 1.5, I guess. Yeah, 1.5 stops. Yeah, 1.5 stops. This one is 1 stop away. They needed to be more. You needed one that was a base exposure and then 2 or 3 stops brighter and 2 or 3 stops darker to really push this for HDR. The good news with it is that with this shot, Capture One, if you only use the 2 images, Capture One's done a good job of blending it, and we can play with this. We will, in fact. So Do you want to pull down all of the highlights and whites? Maybe not. Maybe we pull down to there. But, with HDR, you can afford to do that pulling because we've got a lot of good data in there. It's not full of noise and not full of no information. So we can do that. We can, therefore, see more of the sky. But then we lose some of the atmosphere down here. And I'm sort of in a place of actually, ironically, reducing some of the shadow back down, even though we've used HDR, isn't a bad thing. Just seen a question, Brian. Would you consider a graduated ND filter a better choice for skies like this versus assuming you can get usable results from HDR? I would always shoot this twice. Once with a filter, do it in camera. Once relying on the fact that you may be able to do it in HDR later. The problem with this shot is the brightest part of the image is not at the top. So a traditional ND grad, you're going to have the darkest parts of the graduated filter at the top, and then it's going to come down and get brighter and brighter. Well, we need the darkest part to be here. I can't use a hard GND or a reverse GND because that's going to be darker here and get lighter at the top, but these mountains aren't a straight line. So if I had a filter that was a perfect rendition of these mountains that was darker here and then slowly got lighter out and about, maybe maybe I could play with then lifting shadows and recovering some highlights. So I would certainly try and do this optically. Try using a filter, try it in the field, and then it's going to give you more options. You're going to be less blown out. But there's nothing wrong with trying this with HDR. It's just that those steps in between, we can recover a stop of information in the highlights and the shadows regardless of whether or not we're using HDR. Most cameras have got between, say, 12, 13 stops up to 15 stops of dynamic range now. You're able to recover a lot out of the camera if you're exposing for the highlights and then pulling up shadows. In this case here, I don't need to pull up the shadows. In fact, in here, I could even take, here's my HDR image. I could probably create something very similar to that HDR image. Where are we? From just this single shot. So there's our HDR. There's our single shot. Let's just brighten him a little bit. HDR, single shot. So you can see there, really, it's not adding a huge amount doing this one in HDR. So really use much bigger gaps or steps in between each of them to get some extra dynamic range. That's what we're trying to do. There's no point in just taking your camera from 12 stops to 13 stops. You want to take it from 12 to 16 or 17. So 2 stops difference between, 3 stops different between. Try and keep them tight so you don't get too much movement in the cloud, and you can get a decent result. In this particular shot, I would be tempted afterwards just to add in an extra graduated filter down here, just from the sky, and potentially just drop that exposure down and maybe pull up a touch of saturation up there. That brings more focus then into here. We could, use a little bit of vignetting. Don't go to there, but, a little bit of focus pushing by darkening the areas around. So, a third of a stop, make this the real subject of it. The colors out here are pretty nice, and you're in a decent place. But yeah, from here with the weird cloudy things, that's going to be a marked improvement using just 2 frames rather than all 3. So there we go. Hopefully that's covered it. And yeah, Paulie, absolutely. So if you can fix it optically, do it. If you can't, then rely on other tools like HDR. But relying on HDR is a risky thing because you've seen if things like clouds move or things like, we talked about it before with water and waves, and same with stitching. Ideally we'd have a infinite resolution camera that could see 180 degrees or more, but we can't, so we're compromising with stitching. When you're stitching, be aware you're compromising. So don't just rely on the stitch fixing everything. Rely on the fact that you need to leave yourself a margin around the outsides. You need 30 to 40% of overlap in between those frames. You've got to be quick, because if you take too long from the left to the right, things like clouds and water change. So the stitch has got no chance if you don't think about it at the point of capture. So you've got to think these things through in terms of what the subject is. Barry, what about, sorry, I missed that one. What about the thin halo? Yeah, let's go back to that one. So the thin halo, where the cloud meets the sky. I'm not sure I'm seeing the same halo that you're referring to. So we're at 200 odd percent there. If I go to, where are we, 100, I get that there is a little bit there, but actually this is just, that's the natural thing your camera's going to see at that boundary line of contrast. There is a tool within our details tab, so the magnifier. There is a tool called halo suppression that you can push that up to 100. That's going to try and remove some of that difference, or the added bits of sharpness on the border. In fact, that's on the wrong layer. Let's not do that on there. We do it on the background. So that tool can help, but if this is the one that you're talking about, this very, very thin line, I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's just a sharpening line. And out at 100%, you don't see it. What you're seeing here is a bit of fringing. Purple fringing is probably not going to fix it. Oh yeah, it does a little bit. Okay, so we can see, you see, again, we're pixelated because we're zoomed in so much, but you see this sort of very red-ish pinky line along here. Just zoom in more. As I pull up purple fringing, we get rid of the pinkness, I guess, out of it. But you're not necessarily going to fix that that glow. I wouldn't call this one a halo. I'd call it a glow. It's coming from the sun. But yeah, I'd be okay with that one, to be honest, Barry. I wouldn't worry too much. Carlos, do I know if Capture One is working on sky selections? Do you mean sky replacement? In which case I really hope not, because that's an awful thing that no photographer should ever be considering doing in their right mind. If you mean selecting the sky, that's what Magic Brush is there for. So if you're, let's create a new layer. If I wanted to just select the sky up here, let's just turn on our mask, draw just over the clouds and sky. I may have to do it a few times to include all the bits and sort of tell Magic Brush that that was what I meant, but it can do it. The only problem is it's going to sometimes get confused by things like that rock color being very similar to the sky. There isn't yet a magic eraser. Hopefully that comes along soon. But if that's what you meant in terms of sky selections, the answer would be at the moment, use Magic Brush. If you meant sky replacement, we're not touching that. Wilfried. So the question that Wilfried had was about the color balance difference, and it's pretty obvious here. You've got this really cool sky out here with thunder and lightning going on, and then we've got the fall off from this really orange light here with the street lights. So kind of like we were doing before, there are different ways of dealing with this. Let's look at a few of them. So first off, we're not going to do it globally. If we wanted to do this globally, we can't do it through white balance, because if I shift this here to be cooler, well, this just goes silly. This just goes way too blue. If I try and do auto white balance, so I say, well, let's imagine this barge should be grey. Okay, well, that's made everything else blue, so that doesn't work. So let's pick on a house in the distance. Well, maybe this house should have been grey, so choose that building there, and now this goes really warm. Why? And it's because the light that's affecting the building out here is cool, and the light that's affecting anything here is warm. So there is no way on earth in this picture I can have a balanced shot in terms of white balance in the neatest way, in the nicest way. So we could change the street lamps. I mean, literally go up, change the bulbs in them, make them white LEDs. That will fix the problem. But in post-processing terms, we're kind of limited. So let's look at option number one. Option number one is we draw a nice little gradient mask over the bits that we want to cool down. And with those bits, we can cool down the foreground. Now that works pretty well on this here. It doesn't work so well on the water. So I might need to consider maybe instead of using a gradient mask, we use a magic brush. So let's clear that mask. And with that same cooling effect, let's just add the barge and the grass, a bit of that, a bit up here. So this is where Magic Brush can come into its own, because it can select this quite accurately, and we can see it's done a pretty good job around things like the ladder. So it's not affecting now any of the water. It's a pretty decent way of adjusting it back. So that kind of works. We could, let's just create another new variant. We could instead go into our color editor and say, let's go to our oranges and pull those down. Yeah, that kind of works. Into our reds, pull that down a little bit. We could go into our color balance and say the mid-tone. So remember, this is all going to be shadows. This is going to be highlights here. The mid-tones, maybe we make the mid-tones cooler. So you've got to be careful you don't push it too far, because we are affecting the sky a little bit, but you know, a bit of coolness there on the background layer, that sort of does it. And then overall, you know, we could maybe put in an extra layer with some saturation removal. But there's lots of ways. Let's just push a bit of clarity, not too much, up to there. There's lots of ways of doing it. But the best scenario is actually a mixture of all three. So here's our original raw, I guess. Here's the one that's got that that strange magic brush mask in here, which has simply cooled it down. So I'm going to now also add in a bit more of a tint adjustment so we don't go quite so magenta. We can go to there. I can pull down saturation a touch in there. We don't want to push it too much because this light here should be orange. We're not going to change the color of those lights. And if I haven't changed the color of the lights, it kind of doesn't make sense that things are quite so un-orange, as it were. So let's just go to there, maybe there. And then with our color balance tool, I can go back to my background and we can, again, just shift those midtones to be a little cooler. We can go to our reds and just drop their saturation down independently. And oranges. Be careful you don't overdo this. You see this light up here. If I pull down saturation there, you see what's happening. So where this part here is in the orange area and this part here is in the yellow and this part here is in the blue and red, this basic tool here, unfortunately, is going to create these weird rings. So if you start to see that, don't use the basic tool. Go to the advanced tool, select the color that we're trying to adjust, and just make that wedge bigger, make the smoothness bigger, and then you can pull it down and it will pull down all the associated colors with it at the same time. So we can reduce the saturation of that quite easily. We're possibly reducing the saturation of this down here a bit too much. So let's go back to our adjustment layer and just back that away. We can warm that back up a little bit. And then we go from there to there. So it depends how dramatic you want that shot to look. For me personally, I'd be tempted actually to drop the exposure on that foreground a touch, maybe a third of a stop, just to push the eye again back up to the lightning. But in terms of going from way too warm, which I think is where Wilfried was saying, to here, that's a more natural look than that one. But actually, I'm saying that, it's actually not. The natural look is the one on the left. We have got warm light in the foreground. We have got these yellow lamps warming up all of the color temperature here, and the background is cooler. So you've got to be careful that, you know, that is it in its natural state. This may be more appealing to look at, but that's your choice. That's your choice as a photographer in terms of how you wanted that shot to come out. It may not match everyone else's choice. Others may decide that they actually want, you know, the warm foreground and leave that how it is. Okay, so I think, bearing in mind it's sort of held up, that's it for today. Hopefully everyone is going to get reconnected in this entire town over the next few days. If not, then we'll have some more fun and games next week, regardless. So in between now and then, and our next session, feel free to join in on Facebook. So there's a group on there, the Paul Reefer Live group, where we can cover off any questions that we didn't answer in this session today, and also all the images that we were talking about today. Don't forget, in between now and next time, if you've got images that you want to submit, go to paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. We'll cover as many as we can. Please include your name. It's most important, because if you don't give us your name, we're not going to include it. But also include anything you've done to it or any issues you've got with it so we know what we're looking at. And then in between now and then, Look after yourselves, stay safe, as probably more applicable as of today than other times. And we'll see you next time. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.